Paul and his colleague Marc have just received an award for their research publication in the field of medicine. After giving a short speech, Paul, Marc, and their respective partners celebrate with a toast and dinner together. At the dinner table, Marc reveals that he and his girlfriend Vanessa are planning to throw a 10th anniversary party in July. In the middle of the conversation, Paul's wife Julia is captivated by the intimacy between Vanessa and Marc, whose relationship is younger than hers and Paul's, who have been married for 16 years. After the announcement, Vanessa invites Julia to get ready in the bathroom. While the women are there, Paul talks to Marc, who looks gloomy despite just receiving the award. Apparently, he feels a bit annoyed that Paul didn't give him the chance to speak on stage earlier. According to him, Paul always takes credit for himself even though it's teamwork. Hearing this, Paul apologized and praised Marc for being considered a true friend. Meanwhile, in the bathroom, Vanessa revealed a secret about her long-lasting relationship with Marc to Julia. She said that she and Marc had started swapping partners with other couples 6 months ago. Vanessa said this didn't cause any distance between them. Instead, it brought them closer. Julia tried to hide her shock upon hearing the confession, but on the way home, she couldn't concentrate on driving and kept thinking about Vanessa's secret. On the other hand, after returning from the event, Marc admitted that he knew Vanessa had revealed their relationship's secret to Julia. As Julia's expression seemed different, he said. They were getting ready to sleep, but Marc suddenly proposed to Vanessa, and Vanessa just laughed, thinking Marc was drunk. Julia couldn't stand keeping Vanessa's secret anymore, so in the middle of the night, she woke up Paul, who was sleeping soundly. Without waiting, Julia immediately told him what she had discussed with Vanessa in the bathroom earlier, but Paul wasn't interested in what Julia said. He thought it was nonsense and assumed Julia was still under the influence of alcohol. If he told Marc about it tomorrow, he would probably just laugh, so Paul told Julia to go back to sleep. The next morning, Julia had breakfast with her daughter, Emma, and Paul. She was still thinking about Vanessa, especially annoyed with Paul for not taking her seriously. Paul remained firm in his opinion that swapping partners wasn't a good idea. He thought Julia was just jealous of Vanessa and Marc, but that didn't mean they had to follow their example. Paul felt their relationship was fine, but Julia was equally firm that they needed spontaneity because their relationship had become routine. Paul refused to engage with Julia's arguments and got ready for work. Next, Julia and Paul went about their respective activities. Julia read the weather forecast on a TV station, while Paul was busy in the operating room, although he claims not to care. During the operation, he observes Marc's movements and eventually asks what Julia and Vanessa talked about when they worked out together at the gym. Marc admits it's true, but he and Vanessa are open with each other, so there's nothing to hide. Both are satisfied with the impact of this relationship variation. Marc eventually asked how Paul and Julia maintained their passion for each other, but Paul avoided the topic. He then took Emma to her friend's house, where he tried to advise Emma to be careful when interacting with the opposite sex, especially since Julia had mentioned that Emma was falling in love. Emma felt uncomfortable sharing that with her father and chose to ignore his advice. Meanwhile, Vanessa and Julia went shopping together. Here, Vanessa mentioned that Julia and Paul should try what they were doing. According to her, sharing partners is another way to strengthen love for one's partner. Because of this conversation, Julia, who tends to be conservative, considered Vanessa's words. After returning from shopping, she approached Paul and tried to invite him to sleep together, but Paul was busy doing something and couldn't be disturbed. The next morning, Julia still talked about her desire to try what Vanessa and Marc did. She couldn't stop wondering how the event was actually carried out. She asked her husband to ask Marc, but Paul insisted that Julia was overreacting and told her to stop pushing. Besides, according to Paul, their marriage was fine. There was nothing to save. Julia finally poured her heart out to Paul, saying that she felt their marriage had lost its spark. She also felt that Paul no longer wanted her, so she hoped Paul would talk to Marc about the partner swap event. Feeling unheard, Julia sulked, which made Paul increasingly uncomfortable. When he returned to work, Paul asked Marc to be straightforward about how the event worked. But Marc felt Paul wasn't the type of person who would enjoy such an activity. He also emphasized that this wasn't the right way to fix a marriage. However, Paul was already overwhelmed by Julia's demands, so Marc finally explained how it worked. Paul already knew he would sleep with Vanessa and Marc with Julia, but they had to do it in the same room. Marc then suggested they practice first, like a theater performance, and they would be fully clothed. Hearing this, Paul thought it was ridiculous, but Marc asked if he liked Vanessa. Paul replied no and said he had no feelings for her either. Marc finally asked Paul to come with Julia to his friend Daniel's birthday party on Friday night just to relax. Paul was reluctant at first because he and Julia had a dinner date that night, and besides, he wasn't sure he would enjoy the party. But he finally agreed after Marc assured him that he was free to decline any inappropriate invitations. To make a long story short, the night arrived. Before going downstairs, Paul and Julia agreed on a secret code word that meant they had to leave. Suspicious, Paul felt uneasy, while Julia felt the opposite. She was excited about their new experience together. Shortly after they went downstairs, Daniel greeted them at the entrance while the guests had gathered by the pool. Daniel invited them to look around and introduced them to some of his friends. Without hesitation, Daniel asked Julia to chat with him, while Paul was left to mingle with the female guests, one of whom was Nadine. Here, Paul looked very uncomfortable even though Nadine was flirting with him. He kept an eye on Julia, who was chatting with Daniel, while his wife seemed oblivious. Shortly after, Vanessa appeared and invited Julia to chat, asking for her opinion, and Julia said that she was enjoying the event. Meanwhile, Paul tried to avoid Nadine and excused himself to use the restroom on the upper floor. Suddenly, Nadine, who had been following him, opened the bathroom door. Paul refused Nadine and said he was married, then hurriedly asked Julia to leave without needing to say their secret code word. On the way home, Paul was annoyed with his wife for ignoring the word suspicious he had repeated at the party, while Julia felt Paul was too stiff to feel the joy she was experiencing. Paul also disliked Daniel for approaching Julia, but Julia thought it was fun. Julia finally asked about Nadine, but Daniel said the woman was annoying for constantly pressuring him. Upon arriving home, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what they had just experienced. He wanted to go to sleep and forget about the party. However, Julia wasn't satisfied. She felt that she and Paul should try to fulfill their bedroom fantasies. She bluntly told him what she was thinking and then asked Paul to share his fantasies as well. It turned out that Paul didn't agree. He even disliked Julia's sudden change in attitude, which was now full of desire. Once again, Julia expressed her feelings, saying that she only wanted to share her desires, dreams, and wishes with her husband. But she wasn't sure why that urge had emerged or why it needed to be fulfilled. She just felt that their relationship needed a change. The next day, Paul and Julia returned to work at the office. Marc approached Paul in his office and asked for an explanation as to why Paul had done the magazine interview without him. Marc felt disappointed that Paul hadn't invited him, but Paul calmly replied that Marc was on vacation with Vanessa and couldn't join the interview. Marc didn't accept that excuse, saying Paul could have postponed the interview until he returned. However, Paul explained that arranging the right schedule wasn't easy, and Marc remained disappointed. He felt like he wasn't a colleague, but an assistant. Suddenly, Vanessa arrived, saying she was just passing by and wanted to invite Paul for coffee. To make a long story short, they chatted at the cafe, and it turned out that Vanessa asked Paul to switch partners with her, intending to make a move. She admitted that she knew Julia and Paul needed some variety, and Marc had also told her that Paul was reluctant to do it with Vanessa. For that reason, she tried to figure out what she could do to make Paul feel comfortable with her, but Paul was actually offended by Vanessa's request. Seeing Paul's attitude, Vanessa asked him to stay calm. She then tried to persuade Paul again, as she only needed his consent, while Marc and Julia were willing to do it with them. Paul remained reluctant and tried to refuse, but Vanessa told him to come on Friday night for the four of them to practice. Upon returning home, Paul discussed the meeting with Julia, accusing her of telling Vanessa to persuade him, as Julia remained firm in her stance that she wanted a change in their relationship. Paul then asked her to admit if she was actually interested in Marc, but Julia said she didn't mean it that way, because if she had wanted Marc from the start, she could have cheated. On Friday night, Paul reluctantly went to Marc and Vanessa's apartment. After some small talk, Vanessa took Julia upstairs, leaving Paul and Marc alone in the kitchen. Paul admitted he felt nervous, but Marc told him to relax because this was just practice. Here, Paul asked if Marc was attracted to his wife. Marc was surprised Paul would think that and felt offended. He then explained that they would just have dinner together and chat, after which he would let him go home. Eventually, Paul felt uncomfortable and decided to continue the event. After Julia and Vanessa returned, they had dinner together while at first, They just talked casually about work in the past until they finished eating, but suddenly the music started. Marc and Vanessa invited Julia and Paul to switch partners and dance. Awkwardly, Paul and Julia followed along with the flow of the event. Paul was initially confused because this was supposed to be just a practice, but it felt too intimate. However, in the end, he wasn't shy around Vanessa anymore. Night turned into morning, and the next day at home, Paul and Julia had breakfast while discussing the previous night. Here, Julia implied that she regretted it, which made Paul very upset because he did it for Julia. But Julia clarified that she was just carried away by her emotions. That morning was romantic for Paul and Julia until Emma came and interrupted them, reminding them that it was her birthday soon and she wanted permission to stay over with her friends that day. This time, Paul wasn't worried about Emma's social life and trusted her. Meanwhile, Julia was still feeling happy about what they had done together. She confessed to Vanessa that she felt energized again, and the same went for her feelings toward Paul. That night, Paul, Julia, Marc, and Vanessa ate pizza together after watching a theater performance. The gathering ended at Paul and Julia's house, where they swapped partners again until they fell asleep. The next morning, Emma and her friends return home, but can't get in because her parents locked the door. Paul, who wakes up, rushes to wake Marc, Vanessa, and Julia and get them ready. They finish just in time before Emma and her friends catch them. They all have breakfast together with the bread Emma brought, and later, Emma celebrates her birthday. In the kitchen, Julia asked Vanessa about the preparations for their 10-year anniversary party, but Vanessa didn't seem enthusiastic. She told Julia that Marc was cheating on her, but Julia thought, aren't they used to swapping partners? It turned out that this time was different. Marc was hiding something from her. However, every time Vanessa tried to talk about it, Marc avoided her and called her hysterical. Julia shares this news with Paul, who reassures her not to worry about it happening to them, as he feels their relationship is more open now than before. A few days before Vanessa's birthday party, Julia promises to help her. They meet at a restaurant for lunch. During their conversation, Vanessa still feels troubled and wants to force Marc to be honest with her today about his affair. It turned out that, without their respective partners knowing, Marc's mistress was Julia herself. They had been sleeping together in secret. Julia felt they had broken the rules and made their relationship more complicated, especially since she admitted she had fallen in love with Marc. She felt jealous every time she saw him with Vanessa, and eventually, the two agreed to end their relationship because Marc loved Vanessa. The next day, their affair was exposed, and Vanessa confronted Julia at home. Paul initially didn't believe it, but he changed his mind after reading the text messages on Marc's phone from Julia. He felt betrayed by both Marc and Julia. Julia tried to talk things out and make amends with Paul, but Paul refused to speak to her at all. Since Paul refused to forgive her, Julia suggested they sleep separately. On the other hand, Marc also tried to make amends with Vanessa, but Vanessa also refused to accept him and kicked Marc out. The friendship between Paul and Marc grew strained after the incident, and Marc decided to change jobs. While packing, Paul approached him in the room and handed him their award trophy. Marc didn't feel guilty, even when Paul accused him of being jealous of him all this time, and even going so far as to ruin his relationship with Julia. Marc emphasized that he wasn't jealous. Instead, Paul had been too focused on his ego and had neglected Julia. Despite that, he would still consider Paul his friend. After the brief conversation, Paul's heart became more sensitive. He approached Julia to talk things out and decided to reconcile. On the other hand, Vanessa and Marc also reunited as lovers. Several months later, they accidentally met at the airport. Vanessa was pregnant and about to give birth. Meanwhile, Paul and Julia were planning to go on a trip to Paris to fulfill their long-awaited fantasy.